We heard today, first of all, in the gospel acclamation, that blessed are the poor in spirit, right? And before that, in the psalm, which wasn't exactly a psalm, we heard actually the text of the Canticle of Zechariah, which is where God liberates his people from oppressors. He fulfills his promises. And then after that, in the gospel, we heard Jesus warn the rich against storing up treasure, right? All of these readings, all these ideas put us firmly in the realm of money and power, which can be sort of a weird thing to talk about in church. But the thing is, the Catholic Church has actually quite a lot of magisterial teaching about those topics. The trouble is that we often are not able to access it because of for a lot of reasons, but to my mind, two very important cultural trends, cultural threads that crowd out a lot of space in the way we talk, in the way we think, and that don't leave much room for authentic Catholic social teaching. Those cultural phenomena are Marxism and reactionary individualism, sort of the opposite of Marxism, if you will. Both of these are incorrect answers to the question of ownership. Put simply, whose is all this stuff anyway? Who owns all of this? How do we divvy it out? There's this whole amazing, incredible creation. Who's responsible for it? How do we use it? These are very practical, very important questions, and the church has a lot to say about what those answers should be. The problem is that what the church has to say is not heard in favor of these other two options. So, what do we think? Well, we think that, first of all this stuff, number one, is God's, obviously. Number two, it's communal. It belongs to the community. It is for the common good in the greatest sense of that term. We see this even in Acts of the Apostles. Luke notes that they held everything in common in their original community, right? They were concerned first for the common good. And then, number three, but still very important, we are concerned for the good of individuals, their freedom, their ability to innovate, their ability to take their talents and gifts and use them to build up the kingdom of God on their own terms. That's also very important. So God, community, individual, right? That was, thankfully, how society was run for a long time. But a lot of things began to happen. Specifically, I want to talk about how we got where we are now by rewinding a few hundred years. Venture capitalism becomes a thing. You guys can think of the Industrial Revolution, Charles Dickens novels, maybe, child labor, poor working conditions, right? You started to see problems where people were not putting God first in that hierarchy. In fact, the whole thing was really flipped. It was about individuals, and then maybe businesses, and then the common good, and then somewhere down here, God. And in about 1830s, 1840s, Karl Marx came along, and he saw a huge problem with this. And he said, look at all these horrible working conditions, there's child labor, the economy is clearly not working for people. We've got to do something about this. And so he saw this hierarchy, and he said, I know, I'll just flip these two. So now we have community, where the common good is the most important, and then we have the individual, which is just not as important because then you get greed and all that. And then somewhere way down there, there's God, right? Way down there. Sorry. And we know how that ended. I don't want to get into all that right now, but basically the cure was worse than the disease. Both of these ideas share a fundamental error, which is materialism. The difference between them is that capitalism leaves freedom for individual vice or virtue. It leaves that freedom to decide, where socialism sort of demands that the group exploits the individual and then says that that's a moral and even virtuous thing to do. But in either case, we see that the love of money is the root of all evil. It's expressed in very different ways, but you get back to the same place in the end. So we're called to something else. We're called to God, community, individual. We do not store up treasure, not because treasure is bad, but because we need to rely on God and love our neighbor first. So when we come to these teachings of Jesus, and this is not the only one, certainly, that regards wealth and power, status, the camel through the eye of a needle is another good example. I want to just take today to kind of remind us that, yes, you can go too far in either direction, and some people do when we confront these teachings about money and power. Some people want to push everything in a really unfortunate direction and put a lot of words in Jesus' mouth. Other people, sometimes for the sake of their own comfort, want to take the teeth out of what Jesus is saying and just say, oh, it doesn't really matter. Go on, live your life as society does, and be a good person, and you'll be fine. If we can find some space in the middle, if we can not get too caught up in either side of where the culture is trying to pull us, we can live an authentic, simple life, a life where we are good stewards of material goods, but where they are ordered perfectly towards God's plan for them, not ours.